My name is Jennifer Wasmuth. I'm working at the Institute for Ecumenical Research in Strasbourg, and it might be interesting for you that I'm Lutheran. So I'm referring here from a Lutheran point of view. My interest in dealing more intensively with questions of Orthodox ecclesiology dates back to 2016. During the long years of long-lasting preparations for the Holy and Great Council, I myself belonged to the declared skeptics. After experiences in the past with several conflicts between different Orthodox local churches, the council seemed to me just a utopia. But then, when the plans became more concrete at the beginning of 2016, a holy and great council with the participation of all local churches came into the realm of the possible also for me. And I was also more disappointed when 4 churches cancel at a very short notice. Therefore, I ask myself the following fairly basic questions anew and in principle. Why do the Orthodox churches have such difficulties to be the one church that they confess and claim to be? How to explain the discrepancy between the dogmatic norm of unity and the reality of churches that are unable to convene for a council? When I heard about the conference here in Iași, I thought this would be just a place to discuss the issue and move forward. That's why I chose my topic. However, I did not realize what actuality it would have. Dealing with Orthodox ecclesiology, I found some approaches very helpful, which I like to recall here below. In my conclusion, I like to link them to ecumenical issues. In fact, I assume that the problems of Orthodox ecclesiology are found in a similar way in ecumenical theology, that, in other words, basic ecclesiological problems are addressed here in Orthodox ecclesiology are of general ecumenical concern, and in a way we only can solve it together. So I start with the different approaches. I like to begin with reflections of Alexander Schmemann, as he explained them in his 1971 published and since then often quoted article, A Meaningful Storm. In the background of this essay stands experiences which Schmemann made in the diaspora situation in America with competing juridical claims of Orthodox churches of the same nationality. I skipped the quote, which due to the limited time. Anyway, for Schmemann, the situation gave rise to an examination of the constitutional structure of Orthodox churches in their historical genesis. And as a result, this led him to identify different historically ground layers. The fundamental, essential layer is revealed to him from the church in its beginnings in the first centuries. The most important feature here is that the church was a local church that knew hierarchies, but did not know any jurisdictional forms of subordination of one church to another, of one bishop to another. A second layer, the jurisdictional, or as Schmemann also calls it, imperial layer, was then laid over the basic layer without changing or further developing the first layer. It takes into account the fact that the church, even if by its nature not of this world, is nevertheless an empirical quantity and as such part of this world and in relation with it. Historically, this layer of the church has grown with the recognition of Christianity under Constantine. It received its almost ideal typical expression in the Byzantine imperial church in the form of the symphonic model of secular and spiritual power. Finally, Schmemann combines the third and the last layer with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and the emergence of new political and ecclesiastical centers of power. He sees this process, so to say, as nation building on a Christian Orthodox basis, which is why he calls this layer national. It is interesting, or it was at least interesting for me to note, that for Schmemann it is only in this context that the typical Orthodox constitutional principle of autocephaly gains significance. While this is, as you all know, to be understood in a legal sense as an Orthodox independent church under its own head of church, for Schmemann it is essential to understand autocephaly as a national phenomenon. Its actual historical significance for him is to be determined neither purely ecclesiological nor jurisprudential, but national. This consideration outlined so far seemed to me interesting because those considerations allow the national principle, which is often regarded as a basic problem of Orthodox ecclesiology, not to be understood as an essential component of Orthodox ecclesiology, but rather as a historically much later stage that has laid itself over the original understanding. Accordingly, the local communion, the local congregation, with the celebration of the Eucharist in its center, is a decisive ecclesiological reference point. The local communion already represents the ecclesial fullness, while overarching structures oriented to political or national circumstances are only of secondary or even tertiary importance. If, however, Schmemann understands the autocephaly principle in this context as above all a national phenomenon, this appears problematic from a historical point of view, both with regard to the developments before the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and the emergence of new political and ecclesiastical centers of power, and with regard to the developments thereafter. Schmemann sets the 14th, 15th century as the historical caesura for the development of the autocephaly principle. In contrast, however, it can be argued with good reasons that the autocephaly principle already existed before, and what I would have liked to discuss here or to outline here now, but what I will skip now, that it was not already determined nationally in the time of the 14th and 15th century. There are plenty of examples which I could tell you to show that, in fact, the historical caesura with respect to a nationally determined autocephaly understanding is only to be considered much later than Schmemann suggested. So, against the background of the problems of Schmemann's considerations, an approach developed by Andrei Shishkov, I think he is here. So, and I'd like to talk about this approach just for a moment. Shishkov's reflections takes the starting point from the definition of sovereignty as the German constitutional lawyer Carl Schmitt used it in his concise work, Political Theology, 4 chapters on the doctrine of sovereignty, already published in 1922. Sovereign is therefore who decides on the state of emergency. Shishkov uses this definition of sovereignty to interpret the autocephalic principle. In analogy to sovereignty in the political sphere, autocephaly should be considered in the church sphere. Shishkov illustrates this with the example of the Russian Orthodox Church, whose proclamation of the autocephaly in the 15th century he understands as an expression of an exceptional situation created by the union between the Eastern and Western churches at the Council of Florence. According to Shishkov, this autocephaly principle, which is to be understood, just a minute, as absolute in the sense of the equal rights of autocephalous Orthodox churches as subjects of interchurch relations, is represented by most Orthodox churches. In contrast, Shishkov describes the model of the Ecumenical Patriarch as an alternative, competing sovereignty model. This is only developed in the 20th century with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, when the Patriarch of Constantinople compensated for the loss of its leading position by claiming an ecclesiastical supremacy by endeavoring, in Shishkov's words, to equip itself with the privileges of a sovereign on a global scale. Shishkov sees the sovereignty of the other Orthodox churches threatened by this model, questioning the traditional canonical order. Shishkov's considerations cannot be appreciated without at least saying a few critical words beforehand. For as original as the approach may seem, it also harbors certain problems, at least from my perspective. Thus, the consideration obviously reflects the conflict that has existed for decades between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. So, Shishkov does not often analyze balanced in every respect, but positions himself clearly in favor of the Russian Orthodox Church. Moreover, his transfer of a purely political concept to church conditions seems, for me, problematic. Instead of questioning claims to power in the ecclesiastical context, Shishkov makes use of political framework theory that seeks to legitimize ecclesiastical sovereignty aspiration. Nevertheless, Shishkov's consideration have their significance to our context in that they provide an explanatory approach for an understanding of autocephaly that is not nationally motivated. As the example of the Russian Orthodox Church in the 15th century shows, autocephaly can arise from an exceptional historical situation that requires sovereignty action. Thus, Shishkov directs the gaze fundamentally to the idea of political sovereignty and reveals it as a dimension of the meaning of autocephaly. Inner Orthodox conflicts, as they exist in particular between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, thus become understandable as a confluence of various claims to sovereignty which cannot be harmonized by means of a council. The two approaches presented so far by Alexander Schmemann and Andrei Shishkov are taken up and at the same time continued in the recently published, already mentioned book, Scaffolds of the Church by Cyril Havaroun. I described the content, but I will skip it since we had it already and will have it in the evening, and I will go to my conclusions. I found the approaches presented here to be very helpful in answering my introductory questions, since they clearly describe the problem that prevents the realization of the unity of Orthodox churches. Namely, I would say, a national as well as a political understanding of autocephaly. On the other hand, these approaches seem to me to be interesting because they do not presuppose a necessity. By arguing, like Alexander Schmemann, that the national layer was added much later and therefore should not be considered essential. By assuming, like Andrei Shishkov, that not primarily national but political motives are guiding for certain church decisions, by addressing, like Cyril Havaroun, a national and political understanding as just one among many others, and raising the question of functionality under the current conditions. In this way, the view is directed to the actual mission of the Church, and changes of structures seem possible, even in the Orthodox Church, which allow to fulfill this mission under changing historical conditions. Cyril Havaroun has probed in this context the concept of the border. What is the border at all? If Cyprian of Carthage speaks of borders, he had the boundary stones of the Imperium Romanum in mind, frontiers, not fixed, impenetrable border fences. In this sense, the extra ecclesiam nulla salus should not be interpreted exclusively in a strict sense, but implies a certain dynamism, permeability. Accordingly, the essence of the church does not consist in a rigid distinction between inside and outside, but in a constant reaching out beyond existing structures in the expectation of newly opening horizons. What this means in detail for the changes that are taking place in the Orthodox Church at the present time, that would be and is indeed, of course, its own discussion. In conclusion, I would like to refer here only to the parallels of this approach to the thinking within the ecumenical movement, which, especially in its beginnings, did not settle for predetermined demarcations, but sought to transcend them. Approaches of important ecumenists aim therefore to date also on the problematization of existing structures and especially the ontologization of institutional conditions, while conversely expecting and encountering with God beyond seemingly immovable border markers. So we at the Institute for Ecumenical Research in Strasbourg, we developed a concept of differentiated, or more recently differentiating consensus that also aims to dynamize strict boundaries by recognizing border areas in the sense of ecclesiastical identity on the one hand, asking for overlapping in the ecclesiastical self-understanding on the other hand, which make it possible to understand demarcations as historically conditioned structures that are as such do have their right, but at the same time also point beyond themselves. In this respect, I see a great consensus in the postdoctoral ecclesiology outlined by Cyril Havaroun and recent ecumenical concepts. However, in the current debate on ecumenism, it shows that the structural issues are by no means solved, but are posing new urgency. And I had 3 examples to illustrate this, but I will skip all those examples too, and will just read my final passage here. We at the Institute for Ecumenical Research in Strasbourg right now working to develop a vision of ecclesial unity that is sufficiently open, that is understands borders as frontiers, but which on the other hand can clearly delimit itself in the sense of borders from those claims that obscure the actual mission of the church and let the church become the object of political, economic, or other interests. So in this context, the developments in the Orthodox churches are very relevant to us, and we are watching them very closely, out of interest, of course, in the churches themselves, but also because we expect to learn here a lot about the possibilities and limitations of structural changes in the face of current challenges.